Okay, this is part 4 of America in the Gilded Age. We're taking up again just where we left off. We saw that steam power was first applied to transportation on water with successful steamboats in the United States in the first half of the 19th century and beyond. Um, they became very common on in the river system, the Mississippi, the Ohio, and other navigable rivers in the West, effectively turning them into two-way avenues of communication. Well, it didn't take long to begin using this for ocean-going vessels. The first steam-powered ship to cross the Atlantic did so in about 1838, I believe it was. It took approximately 8 days. I could be a little bit off on that, but it cut the travel time easily in half, if not by 2/3, to cross the ocean. Now, these were, I wouldn't go out on them. They were side wheelers. It just doesn't look safe to me. But you didn't need the wind anymore. Now, old paradigms are hard to let go of, and such is the case here. For quite a while, ocean-going ships still had their masts and their sails, but they'd have a steam engine, and I would think probably at first the steam engine is there in case the wind dies down. And then the next thing you know, the masts are there in case the steam engine breaks. But by the end of the century, that's over. If you picture in your mind the Titanic, it's over 100 years ago, but it's still, you can see the class connection between a ship like the Titanic and the ships today. And you stop and realize that only 50 years before the Titanic, sailing ships were still the norm. There was a type of ship called a clipper, and it had 3 masts. It would spread over an acre of sail, and a clipper ship under full sail was a breathtaking sight. Artists could not help themselves depicting it, but only half a century from the age of the clipper ship to the age of large steam-powered ships like the Titanic. And of course, it didn't make it all the way across, did it? Should have. Okay. Steam power applied to land transportation, obviously, would be railroading. Railroading starts in England in the 1820s. A little bit of a backstory. I like to put things in perspective. The Industrial Revolution began in England in the 1760s. The first thing they were manufacturing, and anything like a modern factory, was woolen cloth. All right. It's hard to tell exactly how far back to go on this, but cloth, which had formerly been manufactured by individual families working in their cottage, and mom and the kids are on the spinning wheels and dad's on the loom. Well, I'll tell you just to illustrate how things can work in an open market. Some inventor came up with a device known as a spinning jenny. Why they called it that, I don't know. But it greatly speeded up spinning raw wool into yarn. Your typical weave family, they can't afford that kind of thing. So you have the first things that kind of look like factories. You get a bunch of them under one roof. You can turn out yarn much faster than the weavers can keep up with their hand looms. So now there's a demand for a faster loom. And of course, someone invents a power loom, which can use up the yarn at that speed. The families that are doing this, they can't afford those either. So gradually, that as a form of livelihood of it was literally, technically, a cottage industry that's going to go away. Well, to power the equipment in these new factories, before the evolution of the steam engine, there's pretty much one thing, and that was water power, rapidly flowing streams. So to have a factory, you got to have 3 things. Excuse me. You've got to have your raw materials, you've got to have workers, and you've got to have a power source. And in those early days, the workers and the raw materials had to go to the power source. That's going to be northwestern England, where you have fast-moving streams capable of turning water wheels that can run factories. So the result is that new cities sprouted from the earth. Cities like Leeds, Manchester, Birmingham, they'd barely been fly specks on the map in 1760. 40 years later, all three of them had over 100,000 people and would continue to grow. You had to take the labor force to the power source. The next thing, you also had to get a vast amount of raw wool to the power source, and they're using the most expensive form of freight transportation ever, horse-drawn freight wagons. And they're traveling over a very poor excuse for a road system. Roads in England were just trails, the foot traffic, occasional horse and wagon traffic. They weren't meant for heavy duty. Um, and they're deep, soft sand if it's dry, which isn't very often. They're deeper, softer mud when it rains. So we need a way to improve this. In the late 1700s, a Scotsman named MacAdam, that's his last name, M-A-C-A-D-A-M, one of those names that becomes a word, he developed a way to pave a road, to harden a road surface. Of course, they would crown it so the water would run off to the edges. And to this day, I think they still use that word. A paved road is said to have been macadamized, or the pavement itself is called macadam. Okay, that changes things. If you happen to have been born on a draft horse pulling a wagon, your life just got a whole lot easier. Picture it this way. You're 7 years old and you just got your brand new red wagon for Christmas, and you're going to give your younger sibs, the neighbor kids, a ride. Which will be easier to pull it over? The driveway, which is paved, or the garden your dad just tilled? You get the idea. So one good team of draft horses could, if you could figure out a way to keep them lined up, pull more than one wagon. We're heading toward railroading here. Just hang on. The problem is, if you get more than about two wagons, the ones toward the back end are going to drift over to the edge. Got to keep them lined up straight. So the next idea, which came along in the early 1820s and just barely had time to be even implemented, and not very much there, was to basically nail, with big old heavy bolt-like nails, rails of wood down along the edges of the road, just farther apart than the wheels on the wagons. That keeps them lined up, and a single team of horses could pull 3 or 4, or probably not 5, but several different wagons without being overly taxed. That hardly has time to come along when some other clever soul mounts a steam engine, and by now they have a much more favorable weight to power ratio, mounts one on a flatbed wagon, connects it to drive wheels, and voila, railroading. So this gets off to a very, very early start in the 1820s. And of course, this is brand new. Nothing like this has ever happened. Some people looked at a train for the first time and knew instantly that nothing would ever be the same again. Others assumed, of course, this is just a passing fad. There was a race between a locomotive and a racehorse, and the racehorse won, mainly because racehorses are much quicker off the line than a locomotive would be. That proves the horses will never be replaced, right? Yeah, right. Well, so that makes it easier and faster and cheaper to move all that wool to northwestern England. Railroading jumped the Atlantic in terms of the technology fairly quickly. I think the first railroad company was set up in the United States in 1828. If I'm not mistaken, and this doesn't matter particularly, it was later known as the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. They didn't have trains running right away. I think the first trains ran in about 1831. And there was freight traffic, and at first I think passenger traffic, and people would ride the trains for same reason they'd ride the rides at Six Flags, just for the thrill of it. Wasn't a serious form of transportation yet. Some of the first trains ran between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. Those two cities are about as far apart as Dallas and Fort Worth. But it spreads across the land quickly, mainly in the Northeast. Railroad companies being formed, trains beginning to run. see what time it is. I got a little bit. And passengers would ride. Now, the locomotive didn't look like locomotives did later. I'll try to find a video or something to post for you. Under extra stuff, by the way, there's some interesting and occasionally fun stuff down there. What was I going to say? Passenger cars didn't look the same either. Basically, at first, they're using wagons built to be pulled by horses. And they just have some theater seats or church pews or something bolted down. We have this wonderful story. It's a diary entry, actually, written by a woman who rode a train in 1837. And it's about how thrilling it was, the wind in your face and all of that, and the smoke in your eyes and the cinders and live cinders in your hair and clothing. But she said that at one point the engineer turned around and hollered back to the passengers that they had attained a speed of 15 miles an hour. Terrifying. As she further reported that the men on the train took notepads and pencils out of their pockets and signed their names and wrote the dates, just to prove it was possible for a human being to function normally while traveling 15 miles an hour. Don't you love it? Now, if you'd been on a good horse at full gallop, you're going a bit more than 15 miles an hour, but might be a bit challenging to sign your name. Okay, people thought it was safe. People assumed it was safe. They found out all too soon it was not. You didn't have a good way to coordinate train movements. There's many things that could go wrong, and too often did. So train wrecks with multiple fatalities are showing up as early as the 1840s. And by, say 1860 or so, there's something like 35,000 miles of railroad track in the United States. And we will take this up after the Civil War under another connection later. But by the 1890s, there was over 100,000 miles of railroad track, if I'm getting that right. And again, I'm tempted to go into what I really need to save for another connection later on. So the big story in the 19th century, one of two, is the application of steam power to transportation. Okay. The big story in communication is electricity, specifically the telegraph. And it had been known for quite a while that by connecting and interrupting a signal, an electric current, you could make what would later evolve into a telegraph key go click from a distance away. Not a great distance away at first. It was just so tantalizingly close. This would work as a communication system with some kind of code of dots and dashes, but you'd have trouble making the current go strong enough to the house next door. And so in Europe and America, there were various attempts to deal with this, and they all ran up against the problem of the signal degrading too quickly. Okay, enter an unexpected contestant, Samuel F.B. Morse. 4 names went by his middle initials. Samuel Morse would be remembered even if he hadn't dabbled in electronics. Samuel Morse was one of America's premier portrait painters. His work hangs in the National Portrait Gallery. But he was interested in this stuff on the side. Rather than continue with something I won't be able to work in the few seconds I have left, we're going to move on from here to America in the Gilded Age, Part 5. I'll take up right where I left off with Samuel Morse.